My name's Julie. There you go. My name's Julie Walensky. I'm from a family of union coal miners from Western Pennsylvania. I've worked in union jobs from the steel mills in Pittsburgh to a rail yard in Cicero, Illinois. I'm also active in the U.S.-Cuba Labor Solidarity Group, which is a group of union activists and solidarity activists who are virtually trying to build relations with Cuban trade unions and also fight against or advocate against the U.S. blockade of Cuba and to demand that Cuba be removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list. So we're wrapping down labor notes and was very exciting to hear that the UAW got another plan organized at Volkswagen's. Yay, yay, yay. And the other great thing to think about was the last year, which was historic for labor in terms of 450,000 workers went out on strike. And I don't know what I've seen just by attending some of these labor note meetups and also just some of the sessions is this layer of young, or not young, but rank and file activists who are talking about rebuilding our unions into like a fighting tool that is better able to defend the rights and of working people and the working class. So there's been lots of talk about democracy in the union and also talk about building solidarity across industry, across state lines and internationally. And so we're going to kind of like segue into solidarity, international solidarity in this session, and talking with a focus about solidarity with Cuba trade unions. It's not to say that solidarity with other fighting workers in other countries from France to Mexico isn't important. It is, but the solidarity with Cuba is a little bit different just because of what Cuba represents. And I don't know how much you all know about Cuba, but in '59 they had a revolution, and for 60 some years, the working people of Cuba have organized and mobilized in defense of what they've gained through their revolution. So through the revolution, they've achieved this access and to free healthcare for all. And really the healthcare standards or quality in Cuba is really recognized worldwide in terms of the quality of life standards that have been achieved through their public health system. And they've also virtually eliminated illiteracy, which is another kind of remarkable achievement because people were mobilized to do that. Their union participation is like 90% of the population are organized in unions. And they have, for 60 some years, they have been so consistent and such an example in terms of international solidarity. And I'm sure people have heard about the medical teams that Cuba has sent around the world, from Lombardy, Italy during the pandemic to countries, Peru, Ecuador, Pakistan, African countries in response to environmental disasters. And they have a medical school where they've welcomed and trained over 10,000 young people from around the world at no cost, with the only requirement is that they commit to returning home and practicing in underserved communities. So their example of internationalism and solidarity is exemplary and something to be modeled. So I want to read a remark that was made by President Diaz-Canel at a solidarity conference. Did you go there?
Last year?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you were? Oh.
In New York?
No, in Brussels.
Oh, no, I cannot go there.
All right, anyway. So a statement from Diaz-Canel, president of Cuba. He said, solidarity only recognizes human needs and demands and places those who give and receive it in the highest echelon of our species. Solidarity will continue to be an indestructible weapon of struggle, and at the same time, a permanent and inexhaustible message of peace that cannot be silenced. Bravo, bravo. Yeah. So this is Cuba. This is Cuba, and this is what they represent. And this is why there's so much hostility from the United States government against Cuba, to the point that today they're facing very difficult times. Economic stressors are immense. Shortages of food, fuel, medicines are impacting the daily lives of the working people, Cuban population, and has caused like a a significant number, hundreds of thousands, 400,000 Cubans have been forced to, because of these economic stressors, to leave the island. So what I hope is that we use this 90 minutes to learn more about Cuba, and we will from our guest, David Ramirez, who's at the Cuban embassy. He'll talk more about what's going on in Cuba, but also to talk about what we can do here in terms of building that solidarity, and also advocating and joining some of these campaigns calling for the United States government to end the U.S. blockade, to take Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism list. And there are a number of speakers. Justine will talk about a labor delegation, and Bill Camp from the Building Relations will talk about some of the advocacy campaigns with resolutions through the unions. So with that, I'm going to pass the virtual mic to Tamara Hansen, who is joining us from Vancouver. Tamara is a leader in Cuba Solidarity Work in Canada, and she is a member of the BC Teachers Union, and also going to be joining a labor delegation with her fellow teachers to Cuba for May Day. So I give you the mic, Tamara.
Thanks so much, Julie. Really a pleasure to be with all of you virtually at Labor Notes today. I just wanted to kind of open today again, recognizing what Julie has said about the important work that is being done in the United States and Canada to put an end to the over 60-year US blockade on Cuba, which is really an attempt by the US government to strangle the people of Cuba. And the responsibility that we have as human-loving people, but also as labor organizers and those who fight for a better world, to work together to end this criminal blockade once and for all. I always like to start webinars by acknowledging that I'm dialing in from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As we talk about Cuba's right to self-determination, I think that it's also important that we recognize Indigenous people and their rights to self-determination. I know that Chicago is also on the traditional and unceded lands of the Council of Three Fires of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations, along with other Anishinaabe tribes. And I think that it's important for us to take a moment to reflect on the responsibilities that we have to Indigenous nations to fight for their self-determination, again, as we work with Cuba to fight for its right to self-determination. I am also, as Julie mentioned, an organizer with Cuba Solidarity Work. I am a founding member of the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition, which Julie and I have also been working together on, along with many of you folks, for quite a few years. We've been working together to organize an annual conference in March in New York City to end the US blockade on Cuba, but also a lot of other webinars and projects in between in order to raise more awareness in Canada and the US about Cuba and about the blockade, as well as with the demand to get Cuba off the so-called state sponsors of terrorism list. I'm also the coordinator of Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba, a local Cuba Solidarity group. And I am going to Cuba in just a few days with the BC Teachers Federation. We're actually working on a union-to-union project with Cuban teachers, where we're working on English language videos for teachers of English in Havana. And so it's kind of an interesting project, and something to think about as labor organizers. you know, not only just campaigning against the blockade, but also being able to organize kind of related work or cultural exchanges between our unions, I think is such a valuable experience, and really excited to be a part of that. So again, thanks everybody for being here today, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker. We are very honored to have with us David Ramirez, who is the second secretary at the Cuban Embassy in the United States. He's also the cultural attaché at the Cuban Embassy. Such a big honor for us to have a Cuban diplomat here with us this morning to open up this important workshop. So welcome to David.
Hello, can you hear me? All right.
Yay!
Very happy to see you guys. So many good friends. Hi, Justine. Hi, Bill. Hi, Julie. I think I
Good morning.
saw Steve a while ago. So hi to everyone. And thank you very much for having me here. Julie asked me to give you an update on the bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States right now. Luckily, and positively, we just received the visit of our Deputy Minister, Carlos Fernando Cosillo, who many of you probably know already. He was a whole week here in Washington, D.C., and now he's traveling to New York. The main purpose of his visit was to to hold what we do together with the United States we have done for around 30 years, which are dialogues related to the migratory situation. So unfortunately, we do not have many more dialogues on any other issue. And during the Trump administration, they practically stopped. But we have had during the Biden administration about 6 more or less rounds of talks with the United States government. And obviously, this is something positive for us because it gives us the opportunity to hold a candid discussion, direct discussion with the State Department, with the US government, and emphasize on basically what's happening right now in Cuba. You most probably already know that we are going through a very tough economic crisis. We have to start calling it crisis because sometimes, people say situation and we cannot use euphemisms. We are going through a very tough moment in our history. Our president has already said that we might be going through one of the hardest moments since the revolution in 1959 triumph. Obviously, it is also important to give a small, background of what's going on. Um, you all know that the Obama and Raul Castro governments had what you call closing, opening of bilateral relations, opening of embassies. There was flexibilization of a lot of sanctions, a lot of economic coercive measures during the Obama administration. Both embassies open here in the US and in Havana. And you could say that the Cuban economy during that very short period of time, which was less than 2 years, the Cuban economy actually flourished because for the first time, American citizens could travel to Cuba without many restrictions. The cruise ships could come from the US to Cuba and dock in Havana. And you would say that our main sources of income, which is tourism, was actually flourishing in the basis, grassroots, because you had small businesses owners, you had restaurants, you had Airbnbs, you had, this economic part of our society, which is very strictly linked to the Cuban people, which was actually having, a good moment in our history. This all disappeared with the Trump administration. The Trump administration promised to roll back most of all of the Obama measures. And what happened was that in less than 4 years, our economic income, GDP, uh, practically collapsed. We were, for the first time, we were actually increasing 3 points per year on our GDP, and this also had a lot to do with the pandemic. Right when we were striving to get better, to get back on track after all of the measures by the United States government, which was basically putting Cuba on a list of state sponsors of terrorism 9 days before leaving office, uh, putting Cuba and Cuban industries and companies and hotels and restaurants in a list where U.S. citizens cannot visit. So we can say that right now, the United States citizens, basic freedoms and liberties and human rights are being vulnerated when it comes to Cuba because you, as an American citizen, cannot travel to Cuba for tourism. It's prohibited. You have to go on certain categories. Sorry. You also cannot, for example, if you want, you cannot stay in Hotel Nacional because it's part of a list made by the Trump administration where more than 600 hotels are prohibited from U.S. citizens to visit, and so on. For the first time, there was a actual live and direct persecution of the ships that traveled around the world bringing fuel to Cuba. So Cuba is a small island, 11 million people. We do not have much resources, except for the quality of our people. But basically we do not have fuel. We need more than 50% of the fuel we get. We need to import it. And for the first time, the Trump administration or the U.S. government started persecuting field ships that would bring this important good to Cuba, and started threatening them and telling them that if they docked in Cuba, they would not be able to dock again in the United States, that their company would be sanctioned. And we have gone through stories, very interesting stories, like having a ship in the middle of the sea, of the ocean, and having to buy it fully, completely. The Cuban government has had to buy ships in order to get them to bring fuel to power the houses, to power the homes, to power the industries in our country. So this is something actually very serious. And after that, what happened was that we started with the pandemic, and the pandemic harmed most of of the countries around the world, and obviously had a very negative impact in our country because we had two choices: either we closed our country from tourism and protected our people, or we did not do it and left our people to die. And obviously, we made the right decision. So for almost 2 years, our borders were either completely closed or very highly restricted for people coming in and going out. And what happened was that this had a horrible effect on our economy and on tourism, basically because many markets just decided to go to other places. The fiber that gets economy working, it got cut in this period of time, not only for our country, for many countries around the world, but for our country was very hard. And during this specific moment, uh, already Biden was in government. I mean, the Biden administration was in power, and his national platform was very specific when he was in the elections. He said that he will swiftly, he used the term swiftly, roll back to the Obama relation period in regards to Cuba. Obviously, that has not happened. He's been in power almost 4 years, and obviously, that promise that he made to the American citizens did not happen. For many years, we already have heard different excuses from both the government and from our friends here in the US, saying that, well, we'll have to wait for the midterms and see what happens. And then we heard the excuse, no, there are certain senators and congressmen that if they are not in the way, maybe we will go forward. And obviously, we have realized that there is just no political will from the U.S. government to go forward with Cuba. And that brings us to today, 3 years of the Biden administration, which has been very hard because he has basically kept all of the Trump era sanctions. He has flexibilized a little bit in regards to the trips travel to Cuba, because during the Trump administration, you could only go to Havana from anywhere around the United States. Now you can go to all the other airports from the US, but still there is much that he hasn't done, and there is a huge list of things that he could do, starting from the state sponsors of terrorism list, which is actually an executive privilege measure that he could just sign off, with his pen on his bureau anytime soon, and he hasn't done it. It's very easy for us to be out of the list, just as it was easy for Trump to put us back into the list. But being on the list it's just not like having this scarlet letter on your forehead. Being on the list is actually very negative because it means that any institution around the world that wants to have any sort of relations with Cuba will be tagged as a terrorist collaborator, will be tagged as an enterprise state that is contributing to the state that sponsors terrorism. So after being put back in the list, so that you understand that how bad this is, more than 50 banks in less than 5 days stopped operations with Cuba, just like that, from one day to the other. Right now, it's very hard for us to have access to financial institutions, to credit, to investment, and there is a lot of manipulation on the subject. The U.S. government says that, okay, so this is only against the government, which is very bad and does very bad things and are very repressive, which you all know this is totally false. But that's the main excuse. The main excuse is that this is not against the Cuban people. So we have to go back to Lester Mallory, the Lester Mallory's memo in 1960, I think, or 1961, when he wrote that. I mean, was a very long time ago, but it was very clear and practically established the strategy of the United States government for more than 65 years, and it's still in place right now, which basically said that the only means of getting the people of Cuba to go against its government is making the situation, the economic situation in our country, as miserable as possible, as negative as possible, in order to force the people of trying to topple its own government that was part of the revolutionary movement of the people itself. This is something that is uh, basically, been the strategy all along. It hasn't changed. Maybe the tactics have changed. Maybe the lanes have changed. This has always been the final strategy. We have heard the Biden administration saying that Cuba is a failed state. We have heard the Biden administration saying that socialism is a system that doesn't work. But we are still here, and we are not going anywhere, and we are going to stay defending the will of the people of Cuba, defending the revolution, and we do not see ourselves as victims, because sometimes what happens with us here in the U.S. is that obviously we advocate against the state's sponsors of terrorism list. We advocate against the embargo or the blockade, because obviously we want to have people here in the U.S. to to acknowledge what's happening, to know what's happening, because unfortunately there is a lot of misinformation, and people do not know that Cuba is actually under a blockade for more than 65 years. Many people actually do not know that they can travel to Cuba, and so we do not consider ourselves victims. In fact, we consider ourselves to be victorious for more than 65 years of resistance, of creative resistance. We are victorious because for more than 65 years, we have managed to keep one of the highest social standards for the people of our country. We have as you said, in less than 1 year after the revolution, we had more than 40% illiteracy rate, and we took basically teenagers and children to the Sierra Maestra, to the eastern part of our country, to teach the people in the countryside how to read and write. And in less than 1 year, we were full of illiteracy. You know, the first country to be free of illiteracy in the Western Hemisphere. We have one of the highest doctor and physicians per person in the world. In fact, it is the highest rate in around the world. And this is because of the revolution. This is not because we just like to be doctors. We have the highest number of polyclinics, clinics, and hospitals per person around the Western Hemisphere. We have the lowest, we had the lowest infant mortality rate until the pandemic came. It's going down again. It went up to 7.1% per 1,000 during the pandemic, and we're trying to bring it down to where it was, which was 4.1 per 1,000. And this brings me to talk about that very specific period, which was very hard, which was very emotional. We blame the US for the death of our children. We blame the US government for not being there, not respecting basic human ideals, basic human rights, not being there in in one of the harshest moments of human history, where they could have waived at least one or two specific sanctions so that we could get oxygen tanks from the United States. For some reason, there are balloons behind me. I don't know what happened.
I'm not sure what happened either.
Yeah, I think that's probably CIA or FBI doing something. Okay, it doesn't matter. So what I was saying is that in one of the most difficult moments of our history, where we could have had access to oxygen tanks, to have our children survive in hospitals, we actually reached out to the U.S. government, and the answer was that we had to get a license to do that, just like that. For people to know that know what a license means, it means that you have to go through OFAC. You have to spend a whole lot of money to get a very specific license, and you can spend more than 1 year to get a license just to do a specific, very basic procedure of buying and transporting a basic good. So this was a very cynical answer, a very negative answer, and which obviously gave us the what we always were suspecting, that they basically did not want to go forward with our country. So yeah, going back to the fact that this was a very harsh period of moment in our time, but at the same time, with the little resources that we had, we managed to create more than 5 vaccine candidates. We managed to develop 3 vaccines against COVID, and we managed to vaccinate more than 95% of our population in less than 1 year, in less than a semester, actually. And we were able to save most of our population, and this was all thanks to our doctors, to our scientists, and obviously to the government that represents us, that is directly linked to our people, that knew that the only way of getting out of this issue was from our own means, from our own creative resistance. And and that's how we are. We are the only way that we can move forward is finding ways to move forward, outside of the United States spectrum, outside of the United States centers of influence. So, right, this is where we are right now. We are struggling a lot right now with food. It's very hard for us to get food, to grow food. Right now we're having food shortages, electricity shortages. We have had in less than 3 years the highest number of emigration from our country to the United States, by the way. More than 500 people have left our country, most of them young people, most of them professionals, healthy people. They have gone to the United States border. And obviously, since there are so many laws in the US that facilitate people leaving our country and normalizing the US, they are normalizing their status here in the United States. The United States government does not see it as an issue, does not see it as a crisis. Meanwhile, it talks about other countries in Central America and recognizes that the economic situation, the internal economic situation of these countries actually have a direct impact on their migratory efforts. But when it comes to Cuba, no. Cuba is a communist dictatorship. We are evil. We are bad. And there is no strategy. There is nothing being done in that regards. So what I wanted to say just before I end what I'm saying is that there is a lot that we can do. There are many silver linings in the work that we do in solidarity with Cuba. What Julie and you guys are doing in Chicago is amazing, and we commend you, and we appreciate what you do. Going to Cuba on a monthly basis, on a trimester basis, on a yearly basis is very important because you get to see the truth of our people with your own eyes. You do not listen about Cuba from MSNBC, CNN, Fox News. You watch Cuba from your own eyes. You learn about our people. You exchange and engage with our people, and that's what we want. We want you to go to Cuba and come back and talk the truth of our country from what you learned. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's more or less, but still it's very important for you to go and see with your own eyes what you experience there. So the labor movements, the trade labor unions in the United States are going through a very interesting, you would say, situation, movement. And this is very positive because we have so much to exchange, so much to learn from each other. The Cuba Workers Central Committee in our country is very interested in engaging with the workers of the United States, of Chicago, of New York, of California. I saw Bill over there, who is one of our great friends. And I think this year is going to be a very interesting May 1st parade. And it would be great if we get more than 100 US citizens to participate in this parade, and I think you are going to make it happen. And so just wanted to end by saying that we are very grateful for what you do, for your constance, for your intensity in working against the blockade. And obviously there is much that we can do, and there is much more that we can do. Definitely, if you guys have some questions, I will be happy to answer them. So thank you so much for having us participate in this wonderful event.
Thank you so much, David. That was an excellent presentation. I think really, really educational for everyone, and very thoughtful, and also, very realistic about some of the challenges that Cuba is confronting today, and gives us some things to think about in terms, again, of our responsibility as the Cuba Solidarity Movement, as well as labor organizers, and what we can do to help the people of Cuba confronting this blockade. All right, we're going to move on to our next speaker, and that is the wonderful Bill Camp. When budgets of state legislature were cut by 40% in 1991, Bill was laid off. He went to work for the California Federation of Labor, AFL-CIO, focusing on support for the Federation's central labor councils and their local unions, helping them engage their members in volunteer political activity. Bill worked as an assistant co-director of the California Labor Federation, AFL-CIO, from 1991 through 1999. In December 1999, he became the executive secretary or chief executive officer of the Sacramento Central Labor Council, AFL-CIO, and this council is the political, policy, and public voice of the 171,000 AFL-CIO working families of Sacramento and the 5 surrounding counties, including Yolo, Placer, El Dorado, Nevada, and Amador counties. So it is a big honor for us to have Bill. He's been working hard on this Cuba delegation coming up for May Day, and we're glad to have him here with us to speak this morning. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Tamara, for very kind comments. Okay, let's focus real quick. We believe that the Building Relations in Cuban Labor is a nonprofit corp, and we believe that the focus on getting unions to both go to Cuba and also concentrate on getting change in attitude by the State Department and President Biden and the members of Congress. And we've had some success. We passed a resolution many years ago opposing the embargo and getting out of Guantanamo, and it was a nonprofit. I mean, it was a unanimous vote at the State Federation of Labor. So we realized that there was a change in attitude. There was a tipping point. So then we began to get labor councils to adopt an anti-SSOT resolution, and we had 13 central labor councils pass this resolution in California. So we've now gone to the president of the California Labor Federation, Catherine Lieberger. Now, president is not the chief officer, but it's the one that runs a convention and is a good friend. And we said we want to put the anti-SSOT resolution on the state convention agenda and get it passed by the state convention. Our strategy then is to go to the unions that we've been taken to Cuba for many, many years and asking them to reach out to their brother and sister locals across the country and point out that the Labor Council, the Federation in California, has passed this resolution as well as the Central Labor Councils. So we want other labor unions and Central Labor Councils to pass the resolution, international unions. We think that's going to be a success. There's no guarantee in anything in life, but the focus is really on SSOT. We've already made it clear that the California labor movement is opposed to the embargo. What we want to make it clear is very specifically get rid of SSOT. So we're not passing resolutions about the embargo. We're passing resolutions about the SSOT. Our goal is to mobilize the labor movement to oppose the SSOT nationwide. Now, why do we think that'll make a difference? Well, 2 things. One is Biden has expressed a real interest in building a relationship with the labor movement in the United States. He's the first person to ever go to a picket line and speak, etc. So we want the labor movement to tell Biden, you got to stop this. And we think that if we build our commitment and our public statements across the country, we'll make a difference. Now in California, there are 2,350,000 union members. So it's got a sizable portion of the national AFL-CIO. So the reality is, if you're a union leader in Washington or someplace, wherever your union headquarters is, that the members of your union in California are voters on your leadership. So they've got some leverage to push the national leaders to make a point to Biden. The second reality, which we don't guarantee, but we believe Democrats will take over the House in November. It's the House that determines the budget, starts with the budget discussion. And we want the State Department to know that this new leadership is responding to the labor movement regarding the funding for State Department activities. And we want this SSOT out. So we're going to say with a single purpose. We're not going to talk about Biden. We're not going to talk about the labor movement demand that the SSOT be eliminated. And that's it, that's the focus. We think that we'll have a good impact. We've got a videographer who's a very progressive person going with our team this year. We go every year and have for many years. And he'll make a video focused on SSOT's impact on the people of Cuba. We'll come back, we'll show that at the state convention of the AFL-CIO in California on July 16th and 17th. Pass this resolution, and then take this video and scatter it across the country with the support of our unions to in California, pressuring their national leaders and their brothers and sisters and locals across the country. What we want to do is, by the time we get done with the election in November, if things change, if things move the direction we think they're going in, then we want to be able to say to the State Department, the control of the U.S. Congress wants a change and wants it now. And we'll start with getting rid of the SSOT. Once we do that, and we're successful, then we want to move to the embargo. We want to concentrate on SSOT at the start. It's been clear that the SSOT is a stranglehold around the people of Cuba, and we got to stop it. We're open to sharing that video with anybody in the country, and we'd be glad to make it available if it's useful to people anywhere. But we've got a strategy that's focused on the members of Congress, on the labor movement, and moving it forward. Point of information for people is that if you're a federal candidate for office, if you're running for the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, you have to start with an endorsement from the local Central Labor Council. So when you go back to get money from the international unions, the first question they have to ask is, how do you get along with your labor council? So if we can get these labor councils to make eliminating SSOT an important part of their policy, we think it gives us some leverage over these Democrats who are saying, I want some money from the labor movement. Well, the labor movement wants some commitment from you about SSOT. So we know that when it's important that the Labor Council do what it can, and we think that we'll build the pressure to move at least the Democrats in Congress to act. So that's our strategy. In addition to getting unions to talk to Biden and make it clear to Biden, he goes to steel workers meetings, he goes to United Auto Workers meetings. We want those unions telling the president it's time to get rid of SSOT. And that's what we're doing. We take delegations. We got a delegation of about 31 union leaders going to Cuba on Thursday, the 27th. I'm going Thursday, but the rest of them are coming on Friday, the 27th. And we'll be there until about the 4th of May in Havana. So we look forward to expanding our relationships and building a real sense of solidarity and understanding of all the stuff we got to learn from the labor movement, the people of Cuba, that we can use in the United States. I think if there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
All right. Thank you, Bill. We have a part at the end of the program after the speakers. We'll see if there's questions that people have for you. So thank you for all the work that you do. Bill's been spearheading the resolutions, and there's information. There's at least over 40 resolutions through labor bodies, and that information is in the back on that table. If people are interested in getting more of the kind of just written examples and the list of who's signed a resolution, et cetera. So,
yeah, one question.
Yeah.
Got copies of the Central Labor Council resolutions passed in California, and we'd be glad to make those copies available to anybody who's interested in the character, because they're all the same.
yeah.
We'd be glad
Yeah.
to-
Thank you. It's on the website too. Yeah. The QR code will get you to that website. So our next speaker, I think about like the day-to-day work in terms of, doing outreach, getting more people involved in these campaigns and building a bigger movement in terms of calling for the United States to end the blockade. And against the SSOT list, getting Cuba off the list. And it can be weary. And I work with a Cuban compañera who talks about this. There's a saying that work is como está empujando un carro, like you're pushing a car. And I mean, it's so Cuban. I mean, I don't know if David kind of uses that phrase, but I mean, if you think about it, like one person can't push a car. But if you get enough, you get the right amount of people and you're strategically placed, you're going to get that car to roll, right? And I think about our next speaker, who I think knows about pushing a car. Justine Medina is a union organizer at Amazon Labor Union. She works at Staten Island. Bravo, bravo. Staten Island JFK 8. She's Cuban American, has years of experience in around social issues from LGBTQ, reproductive rights, Black Lives Matters, et cetera, et cetera. She's so young, it's hard to believe that she's involved with all this stuff, but she is. And she's her and a handful of other ALU organizers and members are going to be joining the labor delegation to May Day. So yeah, great. So I'm welcome, and I'm proud to introduce Miss Justine Medina.
Hi,
Yeah,
everyone. It's it's an honor to be here representing Amazon Labor Union. Yeah, as Julie said, I come from a Cuban American family in the sort of classically thought of Cuban American sense. You know, my father was born in Santa Clara, 1959, the year of the revolution. And then his family, you know, they were liberal business owners, so they were opposed to Batista, but then they also did not like the social reforms, and they came to Miami in the early 60s. And like many people who grew up in Florida, like many Cuban Americans growing up in Florida, I heard a lot of, you know, what I now think of as lies and slander and false stories, but, you know, a very certain perspective of the, you know, Cuban American story. But at the same time, I did also grow up in a household that was against sanctions and against the embargo. So it introduced me to this sort of, you know, starting point of a nuanced idea of that, you know, no matter what your politics are, you can be opposed to these horrible sanction regimes, and you can be opposed to the US terrorism on other countries, you know, regardless of what you think of those countries' governments. And I always think that that's an important starting point, because obviously all of us here, you know, at Labor Notes, we think of ourselves as some sort of leftists, you know, communist, socialist, anarchist, you know, ecumenical, whatever. But we know that we, you know, while the left is in a resurgence right now in this country, we're still a minority of the population of Americans. I mean, a lot of Americans are very progressive on various issues, but they don't necessarily, they're not thinking of themselves as socialists or leftists, you know. They're thinking of themselves as, you know, working class people that want to be able to work hard, take care of their families, and have a good life. And they recognize that that's how most people are all over the world. And when they see, you know, our own corrupt government getting in the way of people having that, they don't like it very much. And so I think it's just important to start and say that we need to be very strongly reaching out to everyone we can think of to support the mission of getting Cuba off the state-sponsored terror list. You know, it's so critical. It's not just our lefty friends. You know, it's literally every single person. Because as David said, this is a real crisis right now in Cuba. A lot of people are describing it as, you know, the, special period 2.0, right? I mean, there's a basic economic blockade on getting food, on getting medicine, on getting fuel. And it's meant to really destabilize the government and bring in a US controlled regime. As we know, the US supports doing all over the world. And I think as a young Cuban American in the labor movement, in the internationalist and anti-imperialist movements, it's been really heartening over the last 6 months to see a resurgence in the anti-imperialist movement channeled into the Palestine struggle. Palestine will be free. We must end the genocide over there. Cuba is a big supporter of Palestine as well. They always have been. But I think it's important, as we're able to grow that struggle and push the struggle, that we make connections to colonialism everywhere, including the connections here at home. Of course, the speakers opened up talking about the indigenous nations that we know that colonial project is ongoing from the American government, but it's also the American attacks all over the world on Hawaii, Puerto Rico, but also on Cuba. Like the United States government's current relationship with Cuba is to try to move back into this neo-colonial sphere. And we cannot prevent that. And we must make these connections for people. It's very important. And I have been so proud to be a part of a union, building a union that is fighting for democracy, fighting for the workers, and we also fight for international solidarity. All of us in this union, from the beginning, some of you may have heard there've been divisions in the union, but actually one thing we've been united on from the very beginning is that we all support Cuba solidarity, and we all support liberation for the Cuban people, and an end to interference by the US government on Cuba. And I've been to Cuba a couple times before, once with another youth delegation, but I'm really proud to be going with Amazon Labor Union workers and organizers who've never been to Cuba before, and they get to go for the first time and they get to see what it's really like. And it is true that while there is a crisis and there is a lot of poverty right now because of this imposed, not a lot of poverty as we think of it, but definitely a worse standard of living than they've been going through. While that crisis is happening, there's still so many beautiful things in Cuba. You walk around Havana and people are, you don't see homeless people on the streets. I live in New York City. I know all of us, we go back home to our cities, like wherever we're walking around now, there's a crisis of homelessness in this country, and the housing crisis is only getting worse. You don't see that in Cuba. More than 90% of people own their homes. There is as David said, there's a food shortage crisis, but no one is starving because the Cuban government, the Cuban people, they make sure that what they have is shared with everyone and that no one will go hungry. Even with all of the attacks that are going on them economically, they're still able to train. How many doctors every year go through their medical programs? It's
Tens of, yearly?
Year-
No, over 10,000.
tens of thousands.
Yeah.
10,000 a year. It's
10,000.
amazing.
Which is more than they had told before the revolution when half of them went to the United States.
Yeah, so that it's just this really amazing, beautiful, free college education for everybody, while young people here are going into massive debt. Young people there are also taking on, important points of leadership in the government. And here in this country, you got a gerontocracy preventing youth from moving up, not only politically, but just in basic job markets. I mean, youth can't get ahead for anything. And I mean, you could go on and compare social example within Cuba that even though there is this economic crisis, there's this amazing spirit. I think of it as a socialist spirit, but whatever you think of it as, there's this amazing spirit of generosity, and real, progress and advancement. And I think it's really important for people to see that. It is, everyone's been making the point, we have to get these state-sponsored terrorism lists, states get these resolutions passed to get Cuba off the state-sponsored terror list. But I think we also have to be raising money to bring delegations of young workers who afford to go themselves, to go to Cuba. I think it's very important that, as I said, tourism is their main industry. So we need to be encouraging everyone to go. And also not just young workers. If you know people that they're middle class, they can afford a vacation, to help them walk through the way that they can go to Cuba, because everyone actually can go. One of the categories of that is allowed by the State Department is support, economic support for the people of Cuba, which, wants you to spend your money in, Airbnbs or private owned homes, and spend your money in private restaurants, and little vendors. But that's good. We want to give our money to the individuals of Cuba and get it into get it to the population there. So even if people have said they've been or they've never been, like, encourage them to go. It's a beautiful place. They'll have an amazing time, and we need to do everything we can to help the Cuban people, but while also pushing these resolutions in our unions and in our city councils. But I want to circle back to the movement, like I said in the beginning, that I think it's really critical that we talk to everyone and that we make this a mass issue. Even though we've had, over 40 of these resolutions passed, people don't really know about it. So what can we do to turn this into a mass issue? What can we do to bring all these people that are getting involved in the struggle for a liberated Palestine right now? It's like, how do we help bring them into the Cuba Solidarity movement? Like, how do we help make connections for people and make this mass consciousness around Cuba as well? Because while the situation is not nearly as dire as an active genocide, that is what certain forces in our military industrial complex want. They want to be bombing Cuba, and it is 90 miles south of our border. It is right there, and they want to start a war on this beautiful, amazing country. And just because, they're embarrassed about losing control of it, 65 years ago, right? They're still just so embarrassed they can't let it go. And I think when you explain that to people, whatever their politics, whether they consider, whether they voted for Trump, whether they don't want to vote for anyone, whatever they consider themselves, in my experience, people resonate with that point a lot. And so, yeah, I'm really honored to be with you all in this struggle. I'm happy to talk after about, what I've seen in Cuba, and also, if you're in a union, if you're active in a union, I'd love to talk to you about, like, how can we creatively, right, like, not just pass these resolutions in our unions, but then how do we translate this into, like, a mass movement, just like in our newspapers, in the streets, because, like, it's critical. So that's what I got.
All right, so before we have time for some discussion, but before we get to that point, I want to bring up a couple people who are going to read messages of solidarity. The first person is a representative from Alderman Byron Sicha Lopez's office. Byron is a city council person in Chicago, representing a Mexican community. He's been a longtime supporter of Cuba Solidarity, has been, joining our picket lines and has actively spoken out and against the U.S. blockade. And actually, Chicago is one of the city councils across the country who has passed a resolution calling for an end to the blockade. So with that, I'm gonna call Lorene Tegros, who represents Byron, but is also a union member from AFSCME, right? AFG. Okay, so, see, here, they want to see your face.
Okay. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be representing Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez here. Just to send a message, I can kind of read his statement. And I'm Lorene. I'm his spouse and political director. All right. Exploiting labor. All right. Anyway. As a representative of a historic and resilient immigrant and working class community in Chicago, we stand in unequivocal solidarity with working people across the world against fascism, dehumanization, and the denial of equal rights to our brothers, sisters, and siblings in Cuba. Chicago has a long history of struggle and resiliency of working people and organized labor that has challenged the ruling class in their attempts to normalize dehumanization and the denial that Cuban labor and all working people in Cuba have been an example of international solidarity. Even collaborating with Chicago, sending medical missions to help our poorest communities, even when the ruling class in our own country look the other way. Our solidarity and full support to Cuban labor to lift the inhumane embargo against people whose only crime has been to challenge the status quo with a vision of equality, equity, solidarity, and a better world for all people for generations to come. We are grateful for Cuban labor's relentless fight for human dignity, equality, and we will continue to fight for that shared vision.
All right.
Thank you, Lorene. Thank you. All right, the next message we're gonna have is from the Cuban Federation of Trade Unionists and Ike Nahum, who is active in the Cuba Labor Solidarity group and also a member of the ATU, or is it ATU?
BLETT.
Oh, so, okay, BLETT Teamsters, who was a railroad engineer from Amtrak. So here we go. Ike Nahum.
Thank you, Julie, and thank everybody for coming. This is very exciting that we're building a network nationally, cross-border, that's gonna follow up and do this kind of U.S.-Cuba solidarity work nationally and have an impact, because we are a growing movement in the United States. I have a wonderful message from the Federation of Cuban Workers, and just want to say a couple things before I read it about what the CTC, that's the Spanish language initials of it, they have a history going back before the revolution, when the Cuban working class movement was organized and underwent a lot of repression and fought in the revolution, and after the revolution developed a leading role as Cuba became more and more of a society where the working people and the working class as a whole was the dominant political, social, economic, and guiding force in all of society. After the revolution, the CTC became a central policy-making body and a conduit for the mass participation of working people. And that continues to this day as Cuba fights its way out of the crisis, as it's been correctly labeled by our brother from the embassy in Washington. So I want to read this statement from the International Department of the Workers, Central Union of Cuba, Central de Trabajadores de Cuba, CTC, which is the Federation of Cuban Workers, a message to the U.S.-Cuba Labor Solidarity Workshop at the Labor Notes Conference, April 19th to 21, 2024 in Chicago, Illinois. Warm fraternal greetings to your workshop and to thousands of fighters and organizers gathered in Chicago for the Labor Notes Conference. We greatly appreciate the proven friendship of U.S.-Cuba labor solidarity with our working class and your activism against the U.S. blockade. We note the anti-blockade resolutions passed in dozens of cities and central labor councils across the U.S. that demand Cuba's removal from the U.S. state sponsors of terrorism list. We are preparing for May Day 2024 to welcome international guests, including many U.S. trade unionists. Our working class and people face increasingly harsh economic conditions that are directly tied to the bipartisan Washington economic and political war against our island. These have deepened under the Trump and Biden administrations. The blockade is economic war fueled by political lies against our reality and the organization of our society based on the power and interests of working people. We note with satisfaction the uptick in struggles for workers' rights, social justice, and the right to organize in the United States in the past period. Long live international worker solidarity, down with the blockade, and it's signed by Miguel Angel and Ismael Druyet Perez for the International Department of the CTC.
Thank you, Brother Ike.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we're gonna have a little bit of discussion. We have a little bit of time left, but just real quickly, just a few announcements. Please, there's some information in the back on the table. There's a packet that includes a number of resolutions, helpful information that you might want to use when you go back and try and figure out like what can you do within your own union. There will be, please sign up. We're gonna organize a webinar for the labor delegations that are going down to Cuba around May Day. And if you sign up on the and get our emails, then you'll know about the webinars that's going to be, when it's going to be scheduled, and you can join to hear from the delegates who are participating in the May Day. And also, if you're in Chicago, we're talking about David coming to visit Chicago in June. So if you're interested at all in helping to figure out how to organize local meetings for him, please contact or reach out to me so we can kind of get you into the loop. So with that, I will see if anybody, open the floor up for discussion, and if there's anybody online that wants to ask a question or make a comment, camera, just speak up. But we have about 20 minutes. So okay, so you in the back with the Puma shirt, do you want to come up here and heard, or do you want me to just repeat your question? Either way.
I'll speak loudly.
Okay, all right.
Hi, I'm Christoph. I'm a supporter of the Bolshevik tendency. And first of all, I want to say I totally agree with what was said at the beginning. It is absolutely necessary to defend the Cuban Revolution. And it is the duty of the international labor movement to break the blockade. But I think as revolutionary socialists, we also need to address some structural problems. And one is, and it's critical, is the absence of workers' democracy in Cuba. There's no such thing as different workers' organizations competing in discussion for power. There's no such thing as an election to a Soviet, like there was in early Soviet Russia. And I think for a society that wants to develop towards socialism, workers' democracy is crucial. And the absence of it in Cuba is a huge problem. So what do you think about this absence of workers' democracy?
All right, so we'll take Joe and then in the back, and then we'll have the panel respond to the comment and the question. Joe.
Well, I wanted to take note of the fact that April 19th, where we started this conference, is the 63rd anniversary of what's called in this country the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a big victory for the people of Cuba. They call it Playa Girón, because that's the name of the beach, and they're there looking at the beach, not coming in from the ocean like the invaders. And Fidel Castro told his unit commanders that day that if they were able to quickly defeat this invasion, they might be able to forestall a full-scale U.S. invasion. They had Marines sitting on ships offshore, and they did do that. In 2.5 days, they defeated that invasion. Now it's been a little more difficult dealing with the U.S. economic blockade that has gone on almost since that time, since I think 63, they signed that into law. I think the work that they've done in California, the Bill DeCamp talked about, they've done some really excellent work getting the union movement to sign on. I think their state resolution against the embargo includes withdrawal of the U.S. from Guantanamo, which is pretty radical. We haven't added that into our resolutions in Minneapolis. And I disagree with the last speaker that Cuba's undemocratic. They have elections there. It's not true. They're not U.S. style elections with TV commercials. It's a ground up system that is much more democratic than the elections in bourgeois countries.
You want to come up here and get on the camera?
Whichever works best.
Just come up here. Get on the camera.
Okay. Hi, my name's Naomi Crane. I'm a rail worker here in Chicago and also the Socialist Workers Party candidate for U.S. Congress here. The Cuban Revolution reopened the possibilities of revolutionary working class leadership in the world. It was the first revolution since the Bolshevik Revolution with a real proletarian leadership that showed a way forward. It showed that revolution's not a thing that happens or something done for it was the mobilization and increasing participation of working people and making possible transforming themselves as they began to transform all the social relations that existed. There's a number of really good books, including one that I really recommend called Women in Cuba, Making a Revolution Within a Revolution, that describes really concretely in the experiences of participants. And I think it gets to the question of, having some scheme of exactly. One of the things Bill Mespina explains in that book is they didn't start with a preconceived notion in relation to the question of women or anything else. They started by mobilizing and organizing to carry out the needs and interests of the working class by the workers and toilers in Cuba. And that is the example of what's needed everywhere in the world. We live under a dictatorship of capital in this country, equally, whether it's Democrats or Republicans in office. And, what the Socialist Workers Party, a big part of what we campaign around is the need for the working class to organize independent of them, that we need to build a labor party based on the unions that can mobilize in these directions on a road towards doing what they did in Cuba, which is take political power into the hands of the working people. And that's the biggest help that we can give to our brothers and sisters in Cuba who have been carrying out this battle, under the most, a war that nobody else has ever faced before for over 65 years, which we salute. And, and part of what we campaign for everywhere is the need to fight to end the embargo, take Cuba off the state-sponsored terrorist list, get out of Guantanamo. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so, Tamara, is there anybody, David, want to respond to the question of democracy in Cuba? I mean, I'll just make a real brief remark in terms of like democracy in Cuba. like this, Joe here said, in terms of, it's a different type of democracy. It's a popular participation type of democracy, where people are organized on a local level in terms of discussing and figuring out how to resolve what issue comes up. And just one little, example in terms of like what it looks like. In 2019, they just had a referendum on the Constitution. There was like 80% of the population. Not only were there numbers of meetings that took place on a local level that just kind of like talked through the Constitution, and there was modifications, revisions, et cetera. But at the end of that process, in terms of the discussions, it came back in a referendum form to the people to vote on it, and 80% of the population voted. I mean, what do you see in this country? I mean, if you get 50% voting on a presidential election, it's like a yay celebration.
Something
But
briefly on this question of democracy, very briefly.
sure.
I think you have to also take into consideration, Cuba is under siege. And you can't separate out in the abstract the question of democracy for a country that is under siege. I would venture that these counter-revolutionaries in Cuba that are funded by, propped up by, directed by the United States government, if you don't have to scratch even very far to see the links, that they have a lot more space than, say, supporters of the Confederacy did during the U.S. Civil War, if you want to get down to it. Cuba is under no obligation to allow people funded by a foreign power that is openly committed to destroy its social gains, to let them function, without any restrictions. That would be crazy for them to do that. Now, if you put it in that context, it looks a little different. Washington is not interested in the expansion of democratic rights or civil liberties or any of that stuff in Cuba. In fact, they are interested in creating the conditions where the Cuban government has to be vigilant all the time and has to worry about plots every day that are being hatched in the U.S. Embassy in Havana, and we know that history. So let's put it in context, but within that, what has been said is totally true. Within that, they have an amazing grassroots system of trade unions, women's organizations, student organizations that actually debate on a grassroots level what's the best way forward from society. The Federation of Cuban Women, it's certainly, and they would be the first to tell you, it's a system with a lot of blemishes. Anyway, sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Following up on this theme, can any of the
move closer?
Can any of the speakers say something about the family code and the other outstanding work that's been done in Cuba to deliver not only abortion rights, but the full range of maternity and infant care, the things that are so shamefully absent in the United States, the highest list of mortality on those two issues in the so-called advanced world, and the process that existed to bring about all those forms of care, as well as gender affirming care. Recently, Chicago for Abortion Rights, that I am a member of and very active in, and a similar group in New York City and the Cuba, New Jersey Cuba Coalition hosted an informational session on Zoom when the Cuban Federation of Women had a delegation to the conference at the United Nations, 68th, I think, annual conference on the status of women internationally. And it was really eye-opening for the few of our activists that got to it. It was fortunately a daytime morning session. But we have since making it available to others on YouTube, online, to talk about what is possible when human needs are put before profit. And like you were saying, regardless of where you're at on the political spectrum, on the need to get rid of this horrific system of greed and suffering we live under, the fact that it exists somewhere in the world so close is extraordinary. And I think something more needs to be said about that with respect to, you know, really more than half our population in this country that are suffering under bans, restrictions, and all kinds of attempts. And we have to fight that fight, and there's so much we can learn from the Cubans on bodily autonomy. So
Thank you.
All right, this really kind of, we are really generating a good discussion going on here, but I want to see if there's, because we're running out of time, anybody on the panel want to address, David, talk about the family code, please?
Hey, hello, I'm back. Very interesting discussion. Really good to know that there are, you know, a variety of ideas, and good to debate and good for dialogue. In regards to the democratic issue about the workers in Cuba, I think it's very important to actually know what's going on within Cuba and the institutions that work around the workers' rights in our country. So, for example, we can talk about the National People's Assembly, how we say it in Spanish, La Asamblea del Poder Popular of Cuba, which is the highest political institution that represents and has the people participating in it. The National People's Assembly, when it elects from the grassroots level up until the highest level, it has three different processes. The lowest process, which is the local level, where we elect our delegates. There is something very interesting. We do not have a partisan system of elections. So there are no parties participating in it. Only popular institutions or civil society institutions, or you would say that the parallel in the US would be either movements or NGOs or even nonprofits. So there are 7 basic institutions that participate in the nomination process of delegates. So there are no parties saying, okay, this is my person, I'm going to give all my money to him, and he will be the guy that you will have to elect or not. We start by nominating from scratch with the people within the city. And one of the participants in this nomination process is La Central de Trabajadores de Cuba, the central workers, the trade unionist organizations of Cuba. So from the very beginning of the process of the election process in Cuba, this organization is participating and organizing and strategizing and being part of the election process. But this goes up until the National Assembly, where we have the deputies, or how we call them in Spanish, diputados. The diputados, which are more or less about 400 and 405 people from all around the country. The diputados, they elect what you would call the Council of State. And the Council of State is the highest institution in our country that controls, audits, strategizes, approves, and puts forward to our national assemblies that we have 2 permanent periodic sessions in a year, one in July and one in December. So these people are very important. I mean, these are the highest institution in the country. And once again, the president of the CDC is a permanent member of the State Council. So Ulises Guilarte de Nacimiento, who is the president of the CDC or Secretario General of the CDC, is also a permanent member of this organization. So you see democracy working from the grassroots level and also from the National Assembly level. But if you want to go even forward, in the party, the Communist Party of Cuba, it has a central committee. And within the central committee, guess who is also another permanent representative and member of the central committee? Ulises Guilarte de Nacimiento. So you see, by saying this, I'm trying to explain that the trade labor unions, the biggest institution that represents the workers of the country, that represents almost 96% of the workers of the country, is present in the decision making in all of the different levels of the country. You will say that he's actually one of the most powerful men in the country, and he is elected by the workers. He is elected by all the workers around the country. I do not remember clearly how many periods that does he have to work, or how many times a year that does he have to get elected. But I can attest that myself voted for him in a specific moment. On another subject, I also wanted to say that democracy in works, obviously, and I mean, I do not want to get into a dialectic discussion, but democracy in the works in Cuba has a lot to do with decision making and approval from the people and from the workers on an everyday basis, on an everyday life. So I could, give you specific examples about how workers organizing and institutions work within the institutions. So, for example, I work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Obviously, we are all unionized. We participate in the union of the public sector, which is one of the biggest unions that integrate the Central de Trabajadores de Cuba. So this organization, every year, at the beginning of the year, we have to vote for the passing of the budget of the year of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, sorry, there's an issue with the camera. Okay. Sorry. I don't know what's happening. Okay. Can you see me? All right.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So what I was saying is that we have to vote for the budget of every year within our institution. But this happens not only in our ministry, this happens nationwide. This happens when you go to the Teamsters, when you go to the railway workers. This happens when you go to the private sector. In fact, this is one of the most important and decisive moments within the private sector, because unfortunately, we still are trying to develop within the private sector the unionizing. I mean, it's a growing sector. It's not a very, for many years, the public sector has always been the most hegemonic within this political spectrum. Right now, the private sector, the business owners do not want their workers unionized. But the CTC is working on a legislation for having them, permanently unionized. And if you want to work in a private institution, a private entrepreneurship or whatever, you have to have some sort of, unionization. So yeah, this is something that I encourage you to go to Cuba, to visit, and to learn about it, because definitely we are very different, but we have many points in contact. And the point that we have in contact basically is that we work and struggle to represent and to defend the rights of the workers of our countries. But I'm not crazy by saying that my country is one of the countries of the world that defends the rights of the workers more strongly, and with the most rights represented than many others. So yeah, I think that's more or less what I wanted to say.
David, we're really kind of running out of time, but in 60 seconds, can you just make a comment about the family code, since that was brought up in 60 seconds
Okay.
or less? I know it's a big nut to.
All right, the Family's Code was one of the most important and existential moments of our revolution in the last 2 years. So the Family's Code was a code that actually was rooted from the Constitution memorandum, Constitution referendum that we had in 2019. So we passed a new constitution, a national constitution in 2019, where we debated nationwide about different sorts of issues, rights that would be represented in our Magna Carta. But one of the most contentious issues was the civil rights, the status of parents, the adoption issues in our country. So what happened was that this, which was a very contentious issue within our country, which was the Families Code, we decided to do a separate referendum 2 years later in order to, represent the rights of the people as more justly as possible. So what happened with the Families Code was basically the same thing that happened with the Constitution. We had talks on all different levels of society. We had what we call the Committees of Defense of the Revolution, which are like the nucleus of a revolution, where you have one in every block where people are represented and go and discuss and debate. Even from that level up until the national level, there were hundreds and thousands of discussions in how the people would want their Families Code to be resembled. As I was saying, it was a contentious issue because, believe it or not, we have a very strong religious sector in Cuba that has different principles to what the basic principles of the Families Code was trying to promote. So there was a lot of discussion, a lot of debate in regards to the same-sex marriage, in regards to adoption from parents of the same sex, in regards to treatment of surrogacy for pregnancies, in regards to many different issues. Right now, I can say that this is one of the most forward-thinking and advanced family codes around the world. Disputably better than many that say are the most advanced in Europe. We can say that we are very proud of the results of the Families Code, because we had a national voting, national referendum in one of the most difficult times in our history, where we were going through a pandemic, where we were going through a social turmoil, where we were going through a lot of counter-revolutionary actions, a lot of subversion from the United States. And we did our national-wide referendum right in the center of that specific moment. And more than 80% of our population voted in this referendum, and more than 68% of the population passed and voted for yes for this referendum. So we could say that this referendum was actually an attestament by the people of Cuba that they represent their people, that they support what their government is doing, that they support the policies that it's pushing for. But it's one of the highest representations of how Cuba is more democratical than many other bourgeois and capitalist societies, where you have one supposed candidate that can only, win an election if he has enough millions of dollars on his pocket, or if he's represented by the elites, and where you only have the chance of, deciding the future of your country once every certain number of years. So by saying this, I think, and I want to repeat, that the Families Code is one of the most revolutionary codes in the world, and a victory for our country. And sorry for talking too much. En patria o muerte, venceremos.
Venceremos, venceremos. Well, okay, so I want to thank everybody for joining us both in the room and online. Thank you to the speakers, David and Bill Camp from California. And please sign up, keep in touch, take some information, because the work is really kind of before us in terms of like trying to get it into our unions. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
But it was so
Bye,
exciting.
bye. Hey, Lorraine, do you want
No,
one of these
I'm good
packets?
on-
I don't know.
Oh,
Do you
no,
want
no, I
for the,
appreciate the-
you know, the stuff that we're giving out for
We're
the,
all like multitasking.
okay, yeah.
One of the
I'm-
things-
I'm not sign off. I'm signing off because I'm cleaning up here. Thanks. I'll talk to you
No.
guys later.
Take care.
Bye.
For your leadership.
How about yourselves? The
Thank
information I put
you.
down